Let's learn about Lucifer Lucifer. Part 3. Lucelia Acosta. Warning, this lore short will go over topics such as grooming, SA, alcoholism, and other sensitive subject matter. This is Lucelia, one of the main focuses of the story. She was born to a lower-class family with the surname Acosta. She was raised by her mother and two older brothers, with her father being absent from her life. Her childhood was rather lonely, with Lucelia often being left to entertain and soothe herself with her hobbies like painting. She often found herself the target of her mother's projections and misplaced rage, which had impacted her in a handful of ways as she'd grow. Lucelia was also a direct witness and victim of her mother's heavy alcoholism, which was well hidden by those outside of their family. Due to her isolated and troubled upbringing, Lucelia wasn't exactly a social butterfly, and often found herself straying away from having a social life as time passed her by. She also tended to be a bit too trusting of others, seeking out attention in anyone much older than her who would give it to her in the form of romantic affection. This had resulted in a tragic early life experience where Lucelia had been taken advantage of and abused by an older man starting at the age of 14. By 16, she had managed to get away, but by that point, the damage had already been done. Never taking the time to properly process the trauma of what had happened to her, Lucelia went into her young adulthood unaware of how it would affect her life going forward. Starting in her early 20s, she began having strange dreams, ones that were far too vivid and frightening for Lucelia to ignore. These dreams would oftentimes expose Lucelia to visions of revolting monsters, isolated worlds, and a large, strange being that would oftentimes appear within said dreams. She would begin to paint what she'd see in those dreams as a way to cope with the haunting occurrences that happened almost every night that she slept. Eventually, Lucelia would enter these paintings into galleries, which caught the eyes of a few wealthy art connoisseurs who would begin to pay Lucelia for her work. This had become Lucelia's main source of income through her 20s, and while it wasn't a massive income, it was enough for her to rent a small home far away from her family on the outskirts of her hometown. Deep into her mid-20s, Lucelia would begin to struggle more and more with her mental health. Her family would attempt to reach out and stay in contact, but she would make it a habit to shy away, especially when it came to her mother. She'd eventually succumb to a crippling addiction to alcohol abuse herself to cope as she began finding it harder and harder to sleep. This was due to her ongoing dreams that had begun to grow far more frightening and strange. Sometime in her later 20s, Lucelia's home outside of town would be located by her mother. This resulted in frequent unexpected visits by her mother, ending with the two arguing almost every time. During one of these recurring visits, she and her mother would get into an altercation, with Lucelia's mother claiming that Lucelia had violently attacked her amidst the heat of an extreme mental breakdown. Lucelia tried to explain that it was in self-defense, as her mother had visited while intoxicated and had grown physically aggressive, but the word of her mother was believed over her own. Because of this, Lucelia would be admitted into a psychiatric ward against her will. She would be forced to stay within the ward for nearly a year. While there, she met a woman around the same age as her named Mona. Mona and Lucelia would bond, and Mona would become one of Lucelia's only friends. The two women seemed to experience much of the same traumas in life, and even had the same struggles with strange dreams and declining mental health. Once it was time for Mona to leave the ward, she and Lucelia would lose contact rather quickly. This was due to a strict no-contact rule that was enforced by the ward itself. Patients could not share confidential information about their personal lives and locations to each other or to anyone who was not a doctor, a lawyer, or family member. Despite this, Mona would try her best to locate Lucelia later on after Lucelia's own release, to no avail. Once Lucelia had been released, she would return to her private home outside of town. Things would not improve for Lucelia, as she'd continue diving right back into the bottle for comfort. She refused to take the medications that had been given to her by her psychiatrist and would begin to avoid any and all forms of contact by anyone who tried. This would go on for nearly 3 to 4 more years, leading into her early to mid-30s. Eventually, Lucelia would be reported as missing by the police after her mother entered her home one evening and found that Lucelia was gone without a trace, her home in disarray. Little did they know that she was not missing, but was in fact deceased, long gone by her own hands, as she drowned herself in a lake during a drunken stupor less than a mile away from her home. Her body had never been recovered. There was, however, one person who managed to get into contact with Lucelia before her tragic end, a woman named Fan L. Fan L was sent to Lucelia by one of Lucelia's former commissioners, who swore by Lucelia's ability to capture, quote, strange and bone-chilling surreal imagery and otherworldly monsters onto the canvas. Fan L and Lucelia would be in contact for about a month before Lucelia's disappearance. The last painting Lucelia would ever paint was the same large and terrifying being she'd often see in her dreams. This painting was done for Fan L, who claimed to have seen the exact same being in her own dreams. When Fan was questioned by the police regarding Lucelia's disappearance, she simply stated, quote, "I don't know what to tell you. She painted what I wanted. We talked a few times on and off over the last month. She kept refusing to take my payment too. I thought that was strange, but she seemed more than eager to do it. What I can say is that that poor woman was clearly going through something. I don't know what, but I've never met someone so erratic. It was actually very sad."